The cabin had always been more than just a retreat tucked in the forested ridges at the edge of the county. For me, it was the one place untouched by the constant demands of the outside world. Years ago, after decades of service and sacrifice, I had poured my pension, sweat, and countless weekends into repairing, restoring, and fortifying this slice of land. Surrounded by acres of pine, with a crystal-clear creek cutting past the front porch and a winding gravel road that barely made it onto local maps, it wasn't just a property, it was my sanctuary. I had grown accustomed to the solitude, the silence broken only by rustling leaves or the occasional deer that dared to step onto the clearing. So, when the crunch of unfamiliar footsteps echoed through the underbrush one Saturday morning, it immediately set me on edge. I knew every sound this land made. That wasn't one of them. Through the wide front window, I saw them, a woman and her teenage son. The woman, in her mid-40s, carried herself with an air of entitlement that practically screamed trouble. Her son, lanky and uninterested, dragged his sneakers through the gravel as if he'd been forced along. I didn't recognize either of them, but I recognized their type. Suburban intruders, nosy wanderers, the kind who believed every piece of open land was theirs to roam. The boy pointed at the cabin with wide eyes, saying something to his mother. She followed his gaze, her lips tightening into the kind of smug smirk I had encountered more times than I cared to recall in life. She looked at the cabin as though it were some abandoned relic, ripe for the taking, as though I wasn't standing, right there, watching. I stepped out onto the porch, the screen door creaking behind me. Instantly, the mother's demeanor shifted. Instead of embarrassment or apology for trespassing, she puffed herself up, her chin tilted high, as if her mere presence here carried authority. The boy stiffened, caught between awe and unease, his hand still pointing toward the flagpole near the cabin. That flagpole. It carried more weight than these intruders could possibly understand. Beneath the rippling American flag hung a smaller pennant, a subtle insignia marking my years of service, my rank, and my history. It wasn't meant as decoration. It was a statement, a reminder of battles fought, sacrifices made, and the discipline that still defined me. The mother's expression twisted. It wasn't admiration in her eyes, but irritation, as though the mere sight of me standing before what was rightfully mine had somehow spoiled her day. She turned to her son, gesturing wildly, her words lost in the morning breeze, but her tone dripping with disdain. The boy shifted uncomfortably, casting nervous glances back at me. I didn't move closer. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood, my ground hands steady at my sides, every inch of me radiating the calm control that years of leadership had drilled into my bones. But to her, that composure seemed to ignite fury. She stormed forward, stopping just short of the steps, her finger stabbing the air as she barked accusations I didn't dignify with response. To her, the cabin didn't belong to me. To her, it was abandoned property she and her son had stumbled upon. To her, my presence here was the intrusion, not theirs. Then, with a suddenness that might have amused me under different circumstances, she pulled out her phone. Her voice grew louder, sharper, as she made a show of punching in numbers and declaring her intent to call the police. The boy's eyes widened at this, his hand tugging at her sleeve, whispering something urgent. But she ignored him, pressing the device to her ear and speaking in rapid bursts, her gaze never leaving mine. There was no fear in me, only a sinking familiarity. I had seen this play out before. People who thought rules bent in their favor, who wielded authority they didn't have, convinced that louder voices could silence truth. She spat out her version of events into the phone, painting herself and her son as victims, portraying me as some strange man squatting on property that clearly wasn't his. When she ended the call, her satisfaction was palpable. She crossed, her arms standing in triumphant silence, her son shrinking behind her. She believed victory was inevitable. In her mind, all she had to do was wait, and the law would come sweep me aside. But I remained unmoved. Years of service had taught me patience, had taught me to endure far more daunting adversaries than an entitled suburban woman with a cell phone. My focus wasn't on her, but on the boy. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the flagpole and me, as if piecing together something his mother couldn't or wouldn't see. His mouth opened as though he wanted to say something, but each time his mother's sharp glance silenced him. Minutes stretched. The gravel road remained quiet until, at last, the distant growl of an engine broke the tension. A county cruiser appeared through the trees, its lights flashing faintly even in the morning sun. The woman straightened her posture, waving her arms as though summoning salvation. Her son looked torn between his mother's confidence and his own growing doubt. The cruiser rolled into the clearing, tires grinding against gravel before stopping at the edge of the drive. A uniformed officer stepped out, his boots crunching with each step as he approached. The woman launched into her tale immediately, her hands flailing as she painted herself as the righteous protector of her son, as though she had caught me in the act of some great crime. The officer listened, nodding occasionally, though his eyes kept drifting toward me. Then, as the woman wrapped up her tirade and crossed her arms expectantly, the officer shifted his focus fully onto me. His gaze traveled over the cabin, the flagpole, the insignia fluttering in the breeze. His jaw tightened slightly. Recognition, dawning. And then, with a suddenness that silenced the clearing, he snapped his hand to his brow in a crisp salute. His voice carried a weight the mother couldn't begin to comprehend as he addressed me formally. "Yes, Major General." The woman froze. Her son's mouth dropped open. The clearing fell into stunned silence, the air thick with disbelief. And in that silence, a subtle shift occurred. Power had changed hands. The mother's face paled, her composure faltering for the first time. She stammered, her certainty crumbling beneath the reality of the moment. The boy, meanwhile, stared at me with wide-eyed recognition, finally understanding the truth his mother had refused to see. I gave the officer the briefest nod, an acknowledgement of protocol, before the silence stretched further. The woman's bluster had evaporated, replaced by the quiet unraveling of her illusion. And as the officer turned back toward her, his expression firm, the weight of her mistake began to settle. But this was only the beginning. The silence that followed the officer's salute stretched across the clearing like an invisible veil, suffocating in its intensity. For years, I had lived with the quiet confidence that came from service, from sacrifice, from enduring the trials of both war and leadership. But rarely had I seen that confidence reflected so starkly on the face of another man. The officer's rigid stance, the precision of his gesture, the reverence in his voice, it all cut through the chaos of the moment with undeniable clarity. The mother, however, did not yet grasp the full weight of what had unfolded. Her jaw hung slack for a beat before she scrambled to recover. Pride and entitlement were her armor, and even faced with the immovable wall of truth, she tried to claw her way back into control. She began speaking again, faster this time, her voice shrill as she insisted the officer had misunderstood, that I was the one who did not belong here, that appearances could be deceiving, but her words fell flat. The boy, once shielded by his mother's insistence, now looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. His eyes betrayed doubt, confusion, even a flicker of shame. He had recognized something she had missed entirely, the insignia, the authority, the unshakable poise of a man who had commanded respect long before she had ever thought to question it. The officer allowed her rant to unravel for only a moment before lifting his hand to halt her. His voice, firm and steady, cut through her protests like a blade through water. He addressed her, not as an ally, not as a victim, but as a trespasser, reminding her of laws that had existed long before she stepped onto this property. property, lines, deeds, ownership, rights. All of it mattered, and all of it worked against her. Her expression shifted from outrage to disbelief, as though the rules she had counted on bending were suddenly rigid and immovable. She turned to her son, seeking validation, but he no longer mirrored her certainty. His gaze stayed locked on me, the man she had painted as the intruder. He didn't see a squatter. He didn't see a stranger. He saw someone his mother had underestimated in ways she couldn't fathom. I remained silent, letting the moment play itself out. Years of discipline had trained me to conserve words, to let presence speak louder than protest. The officer's recognition of my rank was more than enough to tilt the scales. But beyond the surface, something deeper was unfolding. This wasn't merely about a trespasser on my land. It was about the arrogance of entitlement colliding headlong with the quiet weight of earned authority. The officer turned back to me, lowering his salute only after I gave him the briefest nod. His tone shifted. Then, respectful, deferential, but clear. He assured me he would handle the situation and requested only my patience. I granted it, as I always had, standing steady while he pivoted back to the woman. Her protests grew weaker by the second. She demanded explanations, trying to twist the narrative into one that suited her. She insisted that the cabin looked abandoned, that no one had told her this was private, that she had only wanted to show her son a piece of history. But the officer's expression never wavered. He pointed out the posted signs, the clear property markers, the unmistakable flagpole. To dismiss all of it required willful blindness, and her excuses carried less weight with each breath. Finally, her frustration boiled over. She threw her hands into the air, declaring the situation ridiculous, her voice cracking under the strain of desperation. But no matter how loud she grew, the reality was louder. The officer began taking notes, jotting down her information, warning her of the consequences trespassing carried under county law. The boy's shoulders slumped. He no longer stood behind her as a shield. Instead, he seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the scene, embarrassed not by me, not by the officer, but by the woman who had led him into this mess. His eyes flicked toward the cabin again, and in them I saw something rare: curiosity, maybe even respect. He wanted to understand, though his mother's fury stood in the way. It was then that the officer, perhaps sensing the boy's internal conflict, softened his tone slightly. He explained not just to the woman but to the son as well that I wasn't just a landowner. I was a man who had served, a man whose rank carried weight even outside the military, a man whose right to this property was unquestionable. The words hit harder than he likely intended. The boy straightened slightly, looking at me with a newfound understanding, while his mother recoiled, her face paling as her narrative unraveled. For her, the situation had spiraled beyond repair. For her son, it had become something else entirely, a lesson, one she hadn't intended for him to learn. Eventually, the officer drew the confrontation to a close. He instructed the mother to leave the property immediately, his tone sharp with finality. She tried once more to argue, but the futility of her words hung heavy in the air. Reluctantly, angrily, she grabbed her son's arm and began pulling him back toward the gravel road. The boy hesitated, his feet dragging slightly as his gaze lingered on me. There was a silent exchange in that moment, unspoken but understood. He wasn't just leaving a clearing in the woods. He was leaving behind an illusion his mother had built for him, and stepping toward a truth he couldn't unsee. As their figures receded into the trees, the officer turned back to me. His expression carried respect, but also a quiet concern. He knew this wasn't the end of it. People like her rarely accepted defeat gracefully. He assured me he would file the proper report, that he would note the trespass clearly, and that my ownership of the land was undisputed. I thanked him with another nod, though inside I was already preparing. Because he was right. This wasn't the end. The mother's pride had been wounded, Her authority shattered in front of both her son and the law. That kind of humiliation didn't fade quietly. It brewed. It festered. It sought revenge. And as much as I valued peace and solitude, I knew the storm she carried within her was not finished. When the officer departed, leaving the clearing once again in silence, I stood alone by the flagpole. The breeze tugged at the fabric overhead, carrying with it the weight of history, the weight of truth, the weight of everything I had built here. My sanctuary had been tested, my authority challenged, but the foundation was strong, and I was stronger still. The sun began to dip lower through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. The tranquility I cherished was returning, but beneath it pulsed a quiet awareness. The encounter today was merely the first shot in a longer conflict. She would come back. She would not let this go, and when she did, I would be ready. The cabin returned to silence after the officer left, but it was not the same silence I had known before. It carried an edge, a weight, as if the confrontation earlier in the day had left behind an invisible shadow. The pines swayed. The creek continued its steady song. Yet underneath it all was a tension I could not ignore. My instincts, sharpened by years in uniform, whispered a truth I already knew. Humiliation does not sit quietly with people like her. Karen, that was her name, as I would later learn, was not the type to retreat gracefully. Entitlement had hardened into habit for her, and when that habit was broken in front of her son, in front of the law, it planted a bitterness too sharp to dissolve on its own. As I stood on the porch that evening, watching the flag ripple in, the dying light, I knew she would return. The only question was how. In the days that followed, the pattern of life at the cabin resumed. I split logs in the morning, patched the roof where last winter's snow had bowed the shingles, and hiked the perimeter trails I had carved years ago to keep the land in check. But with each passing day, signs of intrusion began to appear. A broken fence post on the south boundary, tire tracks pressed into the soft earth of the access road, footprints too small and too fresh to belong to any hunter or hiker I had seen before. At first I thought little of it. The forest was alive, after all. Strangers sometimes wandered. But as the incidents grew, their intent became clearer. 1. Morning I found trash scattered across the clearing, fast food wrappers and empty cans tossed deliberately against the porch steps. Another evening, as dusk fell, I noticed movement in the tree line, shadows slipping back just far enough to vanish when I turned. Someone was watching. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Karen had been stung too deeply by the officer's recognition, too humiliated by the salute that had stripped her of power. She wanted it back, and her methods were predictable. If she couldn't have the cabin, she would at least try to make my time here unbearable. Her petty vandalism was not about destruction. It was about dominance, about proving to herself that she still held some control over the narrative. But control is not easily stolen from a man who has led soldiers into battle. I did not react to her provocations in the way she hoped. Instead of anger, I brought patience. Instead of confrontation, I brought preparation. I repaired the fence. I cleared the trash. I noted the footprints, memorized their patterns, and adjusted my routines. Where she expected me to flinch, I stood still. Where she expected weakness, she found resolve. Still, the pressure grew. One afternoon, returning from a supply run in town, I found the front gate plastered with papers. Flyers, handwritten accusations pinned to the wood with cheap nails. They bore claims of abandonment, of danger, of illegitimate ownership. Each sheet was scrawled with words dripping in bitterness, painting me as an intruder in my own home. Some even called for the county to reclaim the land, as though she had the authority to rally support against me. I pulled the papers down one by one, folding them neatly before setting them aside. They didn't anger me. They amused me. Each word was a confession, not of my guilt, but of her desperation. Yet beneath that amusement lay a sobering truth. This was no longer confined to petty trespassing. She was building a story, twisting, perception, planting seeds that might one day bear more dangerous fruit. The townsfolk began to notice, too. At the general store, whispers followed me down the aisles. At the post office, glances lingered longer than usual. Some faces carried respect, recognition of who I was and what I had done. Others carried doubt, poisoned by the rumors Karen had spread. She had a way of weaving tales that cast her as the victim, and while lies crumble under scrutiny, they can do damage in the short run. Through it all, the boy remained in my mind. He had been there that first day, had seen the truth with his own eyes. His hesitation, his quiet understanding, had stood in contrast to his mother's fury. I wondered what lies she fed him now, what stories she spun in the privacy of their home. Was he still questioning her version of events? Or had her voice, louder and more constant, drowned out what he had glimpsed? The answer came sooner than expected. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and I sat on the porch with a lantern glowing beside me, I heard soft footsteps approach. Not hurried, not brazen, but hesitant. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, the boy emerged, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his posture uncertain. He stopped short of the porch, eyes cast downward, before glancing up at me. There was no need for words. His presence alone spoke volumes. He wasn't here to vandalize or provoke. He was here out of curiosity, maybe even respect. For a moment, I saw in him not his mother's arrogance, but a spark of independence. The silent question in his eyes was clear. "Who are you, really?" Before I could rise, another voice cut through the clearing, sharp, angry. Karen's. She stormed into view, her face red with fury as she grabbed the boy's arm and yanked him back toward the tree line. Her eyes locked on me, filled with venom, but beneath it all a trace of fear flickered. Fear not of me, but of the truth I represented, a truth her son was beginning to see for himself. She dragged him away, hurling accusations into the air, her voice shrill against the steady calm of the forest. I remained still, lantern light washing over me, watching as their figures disappeared once more into the shadows. That night, as the crickets rose in chorus and the creek whispered its endless tune, I realized the conflict had shifted. It was no longer just about property, no longer just about pride. It had become a battle for influence, for perception, for the mind of a boy caught between illusion and truth. Karen would not relent. Her humiliation had driven her to petty acts, but now, with her son's loyalty wavering, her desperation would deepen. She would escalate. She would find new ways to strike. And though I was ready, I understood the danger. Battles fought in the open field were clean, decisive. Battles fought in the shadows, with whispers and manipulation, were far murkier. The storm was building. The days following the boy's visit carried a heavier air, as though the forest itself knew the conflict was shifting. Karen had already tried trespassing, vandalism, and rumor. Each attempt had failed to shake me, but failure for her was not an end. It was fuel. Entitlement thrives on resistance, and the more I refused to bend, the more determined she became to break me. It began subtly, the way storms do. A new set of papers appeared at my gate, this time more polished than her. Crude handwritten notes. These bore official-looking headers, the kind of formatting designed to intimidate the unprepared. They claimed I was in violation of community standards, that the cabin posed safety risks, and that my continued occupation was under review. The words had no teeth. I had verified my ownership papers a dozen times over, but they carried one unmistakable signature, the Homeowners Association, the HOA. They had no authority here. My cabin sat outside their jurisdiction, miles from the manicured lawns and uniform fences of their subdivision. Yet Karen had drawn them in, weaving her tale until she convinced them that my presence in the woods somehow threatened their neatly controlled world. Not long after, representatives began to arrive. They did not come with weapons, but with clipboards and forced smiles. They walked the perimeter of my clearing as though it belonged to them, muttering into phones, pointing at the cabin, scribbling notes. When I confronted them, they offered polite but empty reassurances that they were just checking compliance. Their politeness was a mask. I recognized the tactic. It was reconnaissance, plain and simple. Each visit ended the same way. Reminded them, calmly but firmly, that this land was mine, outside their reach, secured by deeds older than their association itself. They would leave, but not before exchanging glances that told me Karen's influence was working. She had planted the seed of doubt in their minds, and though they could not uproot me legally, they could still make noise. The noise grew louder. In town, the whispers sharpened. At the store, I overheard murmurs about a dangerous recluse in the woods. At the post office, someone asked outright if I was really supposed to be at the cabin. Karen's narrative had taken root, spreading like ivy into every crack she could find. And yet, beneath the lies, the truth remained solid. The officer's report was filed, my documents were ironclad, and my history spoke louder than rumor. She knew this. That was why her tactics turned darker. One night, long after the last trace of daylight had drained from the sky, I woke to the faint crackle of fire. Stepping onto the porch, I saw it. A small blaze at the far end of the clearing, near the fence line. It wasn't large enough to endanger the cabin, but it was deliberate, a warning painted in flame. By the time I reached it, it was already dying, smothered by the dampness of the soil. But the message was clear. She was escalating, I reported. The incident, of course. The county officer returned, his face grim as he documented the scene. He knew what I knew, that Karen was behind it, but proving it was another matter. She had not been foolish enough to leave evidence, and without it the law could only stand. Guard, not strike back. He promised to increase patrols, to keep watch, but his eyes betrayed the same concern I carried. If she was willing to flirt with fire, what would she try next? The boy's absence during these weeks spoke volumes. He no longer appeared at the edge of the clearing, no longer let curiosity guide him to the truth. I imagined the walls of his home tightening around him, his mother's voice drilling her version of events into his mind. For a while, I wondered if the spark of doubt I had seen in him had been extinguished entirely. But then, one morning, I found something unusual at the gate. Not another flyer, not a threat, but a folded piece of paper weighted by a small stone. Inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were only a few words. "I'm sorry. I don't believe her. It was unsigned, but it didn't need to be." The boy had reached out, quietly, secretly, in defiance of the story his mother was trying to force upon him. That note reminded me of something important. That this battle wasn't just about property lines or reputations. It was about truth, against manipulation, independence against control. Karen, of course, pressed harder. She called county offices, filed complaints with environmental boards, and even tried to enlist local reporters. Each time, her accusations grew more dramatic. The cabin was unsafe. I was harboring dangerous materials. I was squatting on protected land. Each claim was investigated. Each claim collapsed under the weight of reality, but each attempt chipped away at the peace I had built here, forcing me to defend again and again what was already mine. Through it all, I did not yield. My strategy remained the same: patience, preparation, resolve. The truth had always been my ally, and though lies were louder, truth was heavier. Still, I knew the storm was reaching its peak. People like Karen do not stop when they run out of arguments. They stop only when they are forced to face consequences they cannot escape. And that moment was drawing near. It came to a head one Saturday morning when a convoy of vehicles pulled into the gravel road. Not one car, but three. An HOA representative, a county inspector, and Karen herself at the front of the pack. She stepped out first, triumphant, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who believed victory was already hers. The others followed with clipboards, cameras, and measuring tapes, ready to record whatever violations they thought they would find. But what Karen did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had been preparing for this. I had every document, every record, every piece of proof laid out and ready. More importantly, I had the officer's report, sealed and signed, acknowledging not just my ownership, but the attempted harassment I had endured. As they stepped into the clearing, I remained on the porch, calm and steady, the flag waving above me. Karen launched into her speech immediately, her voice rising as she pointed to the cabin, the land, even to me, declaring it all illegal. The representatives nodded along, their pens scratching, their cameras clicking. But the moment the officer's cruiser appeared behind them, their rhythm faltered. The same officer from that first day stepped out, his presence heavy with authority. He carried with him not just a uniform, but the memory of the salute, the memory of recognition that Karen could never erase. The clearing held its breath once again, because this time the battle would not end with whispers or rumors. This time, the consequences Karen had evaded were about to catch up with her. The convoy stood still as the officer approached, the gravel crunching under his boots in the same measured rhythm as before. The representatives, who had arrived full of certainty, shifted uneasily, their pens slowing, their cameras lowering, as though instinct warned them that the tide was turning. And Karen, the architect of this entire spectacle, wore a smile that flickered just faintly when she realized who had stepped from the cruiser. It was the same officer, the one who had saluted me without hesitation, the one whose recognition had shattered her illusion on the very first day. The memory of that moment still lingered like an open wound for her, and now it returned to the surface in front of the very people she had hoped to sway. She tried to mask her unease, launching into another performance. Her voice carried across. The clearing, loud, shrill, and practiced. She recited every accusation she had invented over the past weeks. Claims of abandonment, of unsafe conditions, of violations of community standards that had no bearing here. She gestured at the cabin, the flagpole, even the fire-scorched patch of soil near the fence line, ironically pointing to the evidence of her own handiwork. The representatives nodded along at first, but their conviction wavered as the officer stood in silence, his gaze moving from Karen to me. When at last she finished, her voice cracking from the strain of her tirade, he spoke with the same steady authority as before. He reminded them all, calmly, clearly, that this land was mine, that the cabin was not abandoned, but maintained, that every accusation she had hurled had already been investigated and dismissed. He unfolded the report he carried, holding it where they all could see, its official seal glinting in the light. Each page laid out the facts, the deed, the boundaries, the patrol notes, the harassment complaints, evidence that spoke louder than her words ever could. The representatives shifted again, their clipboards now heavy in their hands. Their glances darted between the officer's documents and Karen's trembling figure. The certainty she had instilled in them was unraveling, thread by thread, and in its place bloomed doubt. Doubt not about me, but about her. For the first time, Karen's voice faltered. She tried to interrupt, to claw back control, but the officer did not allow it. He spoke louder, firmer, cutting through her protests with the weight of law. He explained that her actions, her trespassing, her harassment, her false reports were not just nuisances. They were offenses. And offenses had consequences. The silence that followed was deafening. Her son stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale but his eyes sharp, watching as his mother's empire of lies collapsed before him. He said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the truth, undeniable, standing in the open. Karen's composure crumbled. She stammered, backpedaling, trying to insist she had only been protecting her community, only doing what was right, but every word rang hollow against the officer's firm recitation of the facts. The representatives, once eager to play along, now avoided her gaze, their clipboards pressed awkwardly against their chests. None of them wanted to be tethered to the sinking ship she had built. The officer handed her a citation, his tone leaving no room for argument. She stared at it as though it were written in a foreign language, her hand trembling as she took it. The weight of consequence, so foreign to her, had finally landed. I remained on the porch throughout, silent, steady, the flag waving overhead like a verdict. I did not need to speak. The truth spoke for itself. My presence, my patience, my refusal to bend had carried me to this moment, where her lies finally met the immovable wall of reality. When it was over, the representatives mumbled apologies and retreated to their vehicles, their pens and cameras tucked away, their curiosity spent. The officer lingered only long enough to ensure the situation was contained, offering me one last nod of respect before returning to his cruiser. Karen, however, did not leave with grace. She stormed toward her car, her son trailing silently behind. Her words were no longer shouts, but mutters, bitter fragments of anger that carried no power. She slammed the door, started the engine, and tore down the gravel road, leaving behind a cloud of dust that dissipated quickly in the forest air. Her son, before climbing into the passenger seat, glanced back one last time. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw it clearly. He knew. He knew the truth now, and no amount of noise from his mother could erase it. That was a victory greater than any citation or report. It was the kind of victory that lasts. When the clearing was empty, once more I returned to the porch. The silence returned, deeper and truer than it had been in weeks. The forest seemed to exhale, the pines swaying gently, the creek resuming its steady rhythm as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had happened. Something permanent. Karen's war had ended not with triumph, but with exposure. Her attempts to twist perception had only unraveled her own credibility. The HOA would think twice before acting on her words again. The county had documented every step, and her son had witnessed the entire collapse, carrying with him the undeniable truth of what had transpired. As the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in gold and crimson, I stood once more by the flagpole. The fabric rippled in the evening breeze, a quiet reminder of the service, the sacrifice, the discipline that had prepared me for this battle just as surely as it had prepared me for those overseas. The cabin, scarred but unbroken, stood stronger than before, not because of wood or stone, but because of resolve. My resolve. Karen might return in whispers, in rumors, in the bitterness of her own defeat. But the war she waged here was over. The truth had stood, and the truth had won. And as I stepped back inside, the weight of it all gave way to the simplest, most powerful thing of all, peace, the kind of peace no Karen could ever take away.